Okay. At the beginning, we have to apologize for two things. One is that due to the large number of people, it took us so long to, just for kind of technical and physical reasons, to get the thing going. And secondly, we have to apologize for the absence of Jack Flam, who was announced to be on the panel, but who couldn't come, as I'm informed, to an illness, which we hope is slight, and he could come and contribute something brilliant at another time. That's the bulk of the bad news. Before I introduce the panel, I should like to thank or praise Graham for continuing the discussion of Cézanne, because there's probably no other place that we can think of where the discussion of Cézanne is so important and could be treated in a way which would be important to all of us who are involved. Now, the panel tonight is somewhat different than had been in the announcement. I'll introduce them in the order that they'll speak, I think. On the extreme right is Andrew Forge, who is already known to a great number of you from having taught here for a considerable amount of time, having taught at Yale and contributed to many other occasions here. On his left, my right, is Graham Nickson, who needs no introduction because he's usually the one who gives the introduction, so I won't introduce him. And I'm Louis Finkelstein, who some of you know. And on my left is Karen Wilkin, who teaches art history here at the University of Toronto, and who publishes more things on art than I can keep up with, so I won't enumerate them. And on her left, who has been, what's the word, recruited, dragooned, implored to Shanghai onto this panel at a very late moment is our dear friend Charles Cajori, who is going to be the improvisatore. No, what was the other word? He's going to wing it because he's just been asked to be on the panel. So, I got the order of that pretty good. So, Andrew, you lead on. Thank you.
Are you ready with my two little slides? Just two. I'm going to be very brief because I know that both Louis and Graham have very much to say, and I don't want to. I think the thing that I really would always want to try and express in any discussion about Cézanne is the fact that, in my view, and also in many, many other people's view, it would be quite easy to argue that he's the greatest painter who ever lived. I mean, it's a position you could hold. Now, the fact that you could even think about him like that introduces a whole lot of special conditions in relation to all the other things that you can say about him. For one thing, it in a funny way places him hors d'histoire, if you can say such a thing. It sort of detaches him in a certain way from the rough and tumble, the give and take of art history. The very moment at which you begin to develop some close attention, so it seems to me, to the historical context out of which Cézanne is working. At that very moment, you run out of ways of expressing his importance. Somehow there's a certain divergence. Perhaps Carol Wilkin will completely disagree with me here, but this seems to me the case. So there's a kind of choice. And as far as I'm concerned, the choice has to be to try to go with the greatness. But the historical question isn't the only distortion that comes into the Cézanne case. Equally important, perhaps even more important, is the myth of Cézanne. The myth which surrounds his name and surrounds his work and often, I think, distorts one's reading of his work, comes between one and access to his work. And it's even more difficult to deal with the myth if you take into account that Cézanne himself was quite clearly aware of the formation of this myth, and I would be prepared to argue, contributed a great deal to it in a very conscious and deliberate way. Now, you might, I don't want this point to be misunderstood. There's absolutely nothing of the charlatan about Cézanne. Nothing could be further from him than that. But unless we recognize that he was exceedingly conscious of the way in which he was relating himself to the art of his time, the nature of his ambition, his attitude towards not only the past but also towards the future, and his extreme self-consciousness and his extreme articulateness about the nature of his struggle, about his endless failures, about his anxiety, and underneath the subtext to all that, his conviction that he was the greatest painter alive, and possibly even the greatest painter of all time. These paradoxes run right through his work. And one has to always keep them in mind while, on the first point, trying to understand and, if you like, deconstruct the myth of Cézanne, but then, on the other hand, to understand the nature of his style, Because I think that once one gets an opportunity to look at the work in extenso, like we were able this last year in this great exhibition that we all spent as much time as we could at, I think it's becomes absolutely clear that there are elements in Cézanne's style which consist of a conscious expression of the impressionist position, the position vis-à-vis nature, vis-à-vis the art of the past, vis-à-vis the nature of observation, vis-à-vis the problems of painting in the open air, etc., etc. The list goes on and on. All of these issues, Cézanne takes a conscious and deliberated position in relation to, and I believe that none of these things can be clearly understood unless we face up to the nature of the Cézanne myth and ask ourselves where it comes from, what it means, how we can read it and trace it in the paintings, and how we can, as it were, draw the curtain aside. When I said to begin with that I thought that Cézanne was possibly the greatest artist who ever lived, I think I want to try just at one point to try and illustrate what I meant by that and how that idea could be examined. I think one of the most extraordinary things in the whole of this extraordinary life is the moment at which this dark, romantic, obsessed, expressionist painter emerges out of the darkness into the daylight and begins to paint from nature. The change that comes about round about the end of the 60s, the first 2 or 3 years of the 70s, that transformation from a painter and an imagination that is obsessed with inwardness to the stance of a painter who becomes obsessed with outwardness. That psychological transformation, which is also a stylistic transformation, style moves step by step with psychology. That transformation, a complete sort of apparently a complete remaking of himself as an artist, yet which still has the capacity to reflect back on all those energies and those fears and explosions that had made the younger artist. Just very quickly, I want to just show 2 slides that, for me personally, were of enormous importance in the exhibition, because they're both paintings that well, this one in particular, I hadn't, although I'd seen it a couple of times before, hadn't had nearly long enough to look at it. It's one of the last of the black paintings in the so-called Ballsy style, the Couillard style, that where he's working very, very thick in pastel. And interestingly, he moves into the realm of the domestic scene. It's about, I think, the 4th version of this painting. All the others got scrapped. But the reason why I wanted to just put it onto the screen very, very quickly is to draw your attention to certain features of the painting without trying to knit them together into some sort of general conclusion. First of all, if you all remember the painting, the extraordinary delicacy linked with its force. The drawing of the girl's hands on the piano, the quality of the painting of her silhouette, the pose of the one on the right, the knitting one, the absolutely uncanny control of value that goes right through the painting. At first sight, it's the series of powerful hammer blows, white on black, black on white, these powerful formal effects, the stripes, the patterns, and so on. And then as you move into the painting, uncover these extraordinarily subtle moves. For example, the way that the piano player's dress moves from a grey upwards into white, exactly paralleled by the movement from white down into grey by the wall behind. So there's a beautiful kind of reversal of value that takes place there. And then the other point that I want to bring out about this painting is the deliberation, the quality of deliberation that is present even within this powerful, broad, expressive style. Look at the way that the daring with which the painting is split absolutely down the middle. That crack that goes from the edge of the settee right down and hooks up with the leg of the piano stool. So the painting falls into 2 and doesn't, folds back on itself, doesn't fall into 2. And then all these other things draw attention to the patterns, to the way that the wallpaper takes on this extraordinary Baroque life of its own. So, amazing painting. I don't want to go on any further about that. And let's have a look at the next one, which is that painting from Los Angeles that hasn't really been seen in public very much. It's been in private collection for a very long time, which of course is a late painting, and again, just to draw your attention to certain features of it, the wonderful compression of the space, that sense. You see how, look at how the sky is actually pulled up and brought in front of some of the further trees. And yet at the same time, as the eye moves across the painting and and it has to keep moving. It has no option but to keep moving all the way across. At the same time, the painting opens out into the most extraordinary sort of airy, spacious, dancing freedom that goes right across the canvas, even though it's working on this very, very shallow, compressed kind of bas-relief almost, a bas-relief in which the back plane is the infinite openness of the sky itself. Well, I just wanted to show you those two slides to bring out the contrast between the earlier work. And of course, the contrast could have been drawn much more dramatically if I'd shown a rape or a murder or one of those other black things. But the Tannhäuser overture and this marvelous late landscape, this incredible transition in his life that I think has no parallel anywhere in painting. And that, for me, is at least one of the ways in which I would defend the idea that he's the greatest painter who ever lived.
You must forgive me that I'm going to have to read some notes that I made recently about my thoughts about Cézanne, and in particular Cézanne's Bayless. Could we have the lights, please? Cézanne is not just one artist, but he is many. He nourishes us in many profound and spectacular ways. He is a perceptual wizard, remarkable maker of forms, a man true to his sensations, endlessly searching for their realization, great maker of the abstract metaphor, sturdy realist who took Courbet's mantle for a while, and visionary who transformed lowly apples into lofty Mont Saint-Victoire. He is also the painter of a lifetime commitment to the human figure in the guise of the bather. In art, as in life, truth can come from opposites. One has only to think of Mondrian's decades of painting the landscape, only to ultimately reject it in order to make those marvelous horizontal and vertical relationships. One could not have one without the other. In the case of Cézanne, his activity as perceptual painter and synthetic painter fed one another, and by their opposites strengthened the work as a whole. You could not have one without the other, and have the same position of strength. Yet it is the bathers, above all other Cézannes, that still meet with the most persistent resistance. Talk runs to inability to draw, to sheer abhorrence of his distortions, or his obsessive clumsiness. Misshapen, grotesque, and hideous is how one critic, just recently in 1996, recently carved. Otherwise intelligent and perceptual individuals still draw the line at the bathers. It is particularly interesting then to remind ourselves about the seminal influence these works had on major giants of the 20th century. One cannot think of the paradigms of this century's paintings without the existence of the bathers of Cézanne. Paul Cézanne forged a unique link between the great traditions of painting since Roman times with a deep association with Titian, the Venetians, and Poussin. To make tangible the figure in the 20th century, the painting space, not unlike the bas-relief of the Etruscans and the Romans, or the compression of Pollaiuolo. This compressed space and metaphoric personal imagery make him peculiarly of our time, our century. Yet again, it is possible to remind ourselves that the great leaps made at the end of the 19th century and early 20th century are still not fully understood or digested. If we look at Pollaiuolo's Battle of the 10 Naked Men, and then at Cézanne's Bathers, from the Combe collection, and then at de Kooning's Excavation, connections that link all these three are made clear and exciting. Cézanne held a deep thrall for many artists. Giacometti was no exception. Matisse, of course, comes strongly to mind. Matisse's significant Bather with the Turtle makes us recall that Matisse's own purchase of the three bathers now in the Petit Palais was a major purchase indeed. Only in these two surrogate judgments of Paris is the role of Paris different. In the Matisse, the role of Paris, in the Matisse, the turtle is both Paris and the apple, whereas in the Cézanne, the painter or the viewer has the role of Paris. It is significant that in this particular Cézanne, Bathers, that it nourished Matisse most of his life, and it was made for him as a yardstick to measure all his other further output. It is indeed poignant that a painter who has made the apple his icon, such as Cézanne, should be drawn to the metaphoric subject of the judgment of Paris. The many bathers of Cézanne constantly appear in different guises in Matisse's masterworks, not least of all the small print of the male bathers and its sublime simplification, echoing works like the dance, music, and the nymph and satire. When we look at the Basel bathers, 5 bathers that are in the Basel Museum that we recently saw in Philadelphia, we can see the immediate connection to Picasso, the Mademoiselles d'Avignon especially. Recently, whilst looking at the big lake bathers from London, I couldn't help musing at how tame the Mademoiselles seemed, its forms less powerful, in contrast to the Cézanne. A powerful great painting made soft by Cézanne's powerful powerhouse. Curiously, there are other passages in the London bathers that remind us of other great paintings. In the incident of the dog in the forefront of the painting we're looking at this moment, we instinctively recognize having seen it somewhere before. We've seen it in Bonnard's Bathtub series. Until recently, most people were unaware of the availability of some of the greatest of the bather paintings. A personal favorite of mine is Bathers at Rest from the Barnes collection. Obviously, this painting held a specific affectionate place in Cézanne's heart because it was this work that he turned to reproduce in a print form 20 years later. Marvelously obsessive, the ridges of thick paint exude with rigorous return corrections. A side of the cloud and the sky, the edge of a mountain and the space beyond, the corner of a field and a tree, and above all, the knees. Those marvelous knees, so thick and endlessly reworked, trying to get them right. It is this painting that we see two great elements vying for realization. The knees are his obsession with form. The wondrous and surprising green triangle responds to his obsession with color and playing. It is no wonder that Balthus found that walking figure with arms upraised. It is also little wonder that we think of Diebenkorn when looking at that sliding, warm, acid green shape cutting into those cool green blues. We're not surprised to see that the powerful central figure return again in a more iconic guise 10 years later, this time isolated, without friends. By now, he is the mountain that once was behind him, truly a figure in his own ground, enmeshed and embedded in the bedrock of the compressed space. When we look again at another late Bathers from the Barnes Foundation, we see not only Bono's dog again, but images and ghosts from the past. If we look vertically up from the top of the dog in the center, we can see that the woman in the center is surely from Rembrandt's Cezanne and the Elders. And if we travel to the right of the picture, we are aware of another transformation, a Saint Sebastian, from which those fateful arrows pictorially are changed into the branches of the supporting tree. There is another familiar form that is relevant here, one from a painting of supreme magic and metaphor, the Titian Flaying of Marsyas. Itself an allegory of creativity. Is this the clue to unlock the power of this particular late great Bathers? It is, after all, Titian who is a major contender for Cézanne's favorite painter. In this painting on the left side, the act of creativity is truly in action. The woman on the far right is virtually in and out of becoming, is an act of becoming, emerging from her robes and towels, as surely as the figure emerges from paint on material canvas. Her very form is transformed, her head striving to see. She emerges as a found metaphor as much as any Botticelli Venus. As we approach the center from the left, we follow the illusion to the optimism and baptism of painting's commitment. However, it is the base we find our eyes turning to at this point. Like a Quattrocello Prudello, a procession of shape, form in the guise of a basket of fruit. One's animal nature in the guise of the dog, and colour in the nature of the melon as a pot of colour. They are all represented. This progression of relationships leads us up to the right side, and painting's passion, pain, and anguish. The vertical naked figure is vulnerable to the arrows of criticism. No stranger to Cézanne at this time, I might add. Our contemporary thoughts turn to the position of the artist naked on the street corner, comes particularly to mind. If we look at Pollaiolo's, we do not stay formally with the right side, but we return to the center, vignetted by the two arms, hands touching, right and left side surrounding the Cézanne figure. That is the figure surprised, looking out at us, the viewers, the elders, judging and coveting. Even the very clouds are anthropomorphic, or rather bat-like. The great mass of clouds is as near to Matisse's view of bats in its sheer mass and weight than we can get. This majestic cloud becomes a pictorial equivalent of the artist aspiring to the heavens. The bathers, you see, are really painting itself for Cézanne. Thank you.
There must be an easier way to do that. I wouldn't dare disagree publicly or privately with Andrew George, and I certainly have no intention of disagreeing with him about Cézanne. If you think about the history of Western culture, a handful of individuals have changed the way we perceive the world around us, and even the way we think about ourselves. And on my list, in the sciences, think of Galileo, Charles Darwin, Albert Einstein, perhaps Sigmund Freud, and in art, Giotto and Paul Cézanne. 500 years of traditional Western painting, especially the illusionism that artists strove for from the 14th to the 19th centuries, were signaled by Giotto's robustly modeled figures. And Cézanne was the first to suggest how these deeply entrenched values could be transformed. His pictures powerfully evoke the physical reality of our surroundings, but they do so not by replicating appearances, but by creating independent structures built of color, with unprecedented emphasis on the material fact of paint on a flat surface. For all the arresting newness of his art, however, Cézanne never rejected tradition. To my mind, he wrote in 1905, which is at the very end of his life, "One should not substitute oneself for the past. One has merely to add a new link." And he certainly achieved his aim. His work connects the past with what was to come, clearly pointing to what would be the future of adventurous painting. But at the same time, it's profoundly informed by the classicism of Nicolas Poussin, the romanticism of Eugène Delacroix, the realism of Gustave Courbet, and, as we've seen, much more. 2 years before his death, at work on pictures that still appear innovative and challenging and difficult, Cézanne wrote to Émile Bernard that the greatest painters were the Venetians and the Spaniards. Paradox is the operative word, I think, as Andrew very eloquently described it. Cézanne's art is full of contradictions. It's dispassionate and full of feeling, it's disciplined and intense, it's detached and deeply engaged, it's profoundly inventive and no less profoundly rooted in actual experience. His pictures seem at once inevitable and willful, immutable and about to dissipate into a gathering of isolated strokes. Cézanne's celebrated method of rendering form with juxtaposed patches of warm and cool color creates a wholly convincing sense of bulk and mass, but at the same time, his deliberate placement of those patches forcibly reminds us of the flatness of the canvas and the artifice of painting itself. His disjunctive touches, his slow accretion of carefully orchestrated tonalities, make us recapitulate his fierce scrutiny of the motif, so that the disembodied act of seeing becomes as physical and tangible as the repetitive paths of pigment. Cézanne's work vibrates with the tension between these contradictory notions, and it is this sense of unrest, I would argue, of simultaneous instability and solidity that gives his pictures much of their continuing power to disturb and to exalt. And it's part of what makes them modern. It's part of what makes them great. One of the biggest apparent paradoxes is the shift that Andrew discussed between the early work and what we think of more popularly as the typical Cézanne. Could I have the lights, please? This is not a restful person, this early self-portrait. Cézanne's youthful works are, to put it politely, uncomfortable, superheated, and even apparently neutral images.
There's two switches. It might be.
Oh. Try pushing the one that's connected to the projector, yeah. I mean, even apparently neutral images, landscapes, still lives, portraits, as we'll see, share the feverish intensity of the violent, erotic, and religious subjects and the obscure, lurid allegories of his early years. This still life, which he liked so much that he included it in the background of his portrait, one of his two portraits of his father. The one where the father is sitting reading the newspaper in the armchair that appeared in the right-hand side of the overture of Tannhäuser. Portraits of his uncle, the extraordinarily patient and cooperative Uncle Dominique, who sat for this whole series of remarkable Guyal portraits executed with the palette knife at the rate of one a day. Very, very different than what we know of Cézanne's later practice, where, for example, the portrait of Baudelaire took, 116 sittings and was broken off only because Cézanne was going back to Aix from Paris, and that was the only reason he stopped. But these flayed surfaces with the layers and layers and layers of paint that are splashed onto the canvas. This Uncle Dominique is a monk. There are endless others. Neutral, certainly an apparently neutral subject that has the same passion as the more charged subjects. This tender portrait, there's that armchair again, of his friend, the painter Achille Ampère, which certainly has been a great deal discussed. All of these pictures, this body of work that is, whether it is a portrait, whether it is still life, whether it is a landscape, or a religious painting such as this entry of Christ into limbo, they have the same sense of intensity and passion. It's a body of work that is seemingly unlike the cool, slowly wrought paintings of his maturity. Only the ambiguous bathers that preoccupied Cézanne throughout his life seem related to these agitated biblical scenes and the sensational bacchanals of the 1860s and the early 1870s. These formative works, however, bear witness to Cézanne's struggle with his strengths and his weaknesses. You watch him battling it out with recalcitrant materials in these paintings. Drawing is awkward. Paint handling, whether in oil or watercolor, is often clogged. And where Cézanne's mature pictures evoke elemental forms with the most fragile means, muscular quivering drawing and transient gatherings of transparent planes, his early works are labored illustrations of fraught dramas. This Temptation of St. Anthony, which is a marvelous picture, but not one that suggests ease, mastery. It's a battle to the finish. Every form, the thighs, the buttocks, these rolls of flesh are almost wrenched out of that painting. It's It's as though he's pulling the lights up out of this all-enveloping darkness, as though he were pulling the image out of the darkest parts of his own unconscious. But when pressed, the young, eager painter could paint quite skillfully, especially when he's been copying works of art by artists he admired. If you saw the wonderful early works exhibition done by John Gowing a few years ago, it's probably longer ago than I think, but vividly still in my mind, there was a very revealing copy of Delacroix's work of Dante. Very small picture, of course, the Delacroix is much larger. And it was fascinating for two reasons. One, that it, of course, underlined what is very clear from the rest of the work, that Cézanne was fascinated by Delacroix. A great deal of this violent chiaroscuro and subject matter of these early works comes out of Delacroix. And it also shows him painting quite suavely and elegantly, and giving you a sense of the figure that is absolutely convincing and totally different from these struggling, labored, wrought with difficulty paintings that we associate with the early years. His heroes in these years obviously ranged from Delacroix, who was the quintessential romantic, and as I say, not only the source of the literary subjects. You don't have to think very hard to think where that figure on the left is coming from, if you know your Delacroix. The lush palette, the violent contrasts of dark and light, those can all be attributed to Delacroix's own brand of lush exoticism. But one of the other great heroes for Courbet was Courbet, who was the quintessential realist and the source of the rather brutal early landscapes of the young Cézanne. And Courbet, I think, offered another kind of model. He offered a model of a new way of being an artist. He was equally renowned for the gritty intensity of his paintings and for his defiance of the establishment, and a wholly modern sense of publicity that I think would have served him in very good stead had he been alive in the 1980s. Courbet thrived on controversy, routinely submitting works to the Salon that were calculated to elicit outrage, and organizing as well his own highly publicized independent exhibitions. So I think he had an enormous influence on Cézanne's generation as a way of being enormously successful that did not owe anything to the traditional rules. There are two versions of this painting. One comes with the Delacroix servant and one comes without. And they're both called Afternoon in Naples, and I have no idea why. The 1860s, which is the moment of these paintings, is a moment when not only was there the example of Courbet, who was at that time enormously successful, all the troubles of his later life were still before him, but something was starting to happen within the establishment as well. The Salon's traditional preference for large-scale narrative painting had begun to erode, much to the consternation of a public who had been trained to value pictures of heroic figures in action as superior to any others. And large-scale realist landscapes, such as those by Camille Corot, which you can see at the Metropolitan these days, and the Barbizon painters, began to be taken as seriously as scenes from mythology, ancient history, or the Bible. They offered a stimulating example to a younger generation of painters, including Cézanne, who were interested in recording their observations truthfully. Courbet's landscapes were the most energetic, robust versions of this idiom, which was part of their appeal. But Cézanne also grasped the importance of Courbet's varied, apparently inconsistent paint application, something that 19th century eyes found disturbing often, and even 20th century eyes can find disturbing. And he made paint handling itself crucial to the expressive force of his own pictures. As we've seen, that was first manifest in the palette knife pictures of the 1860s, those near-brutal portraits of the family and of friends rendered with slabs of thick, dragged paint. They're very startling pictures to this day. Sheer force of feeling wrenches them almost off the wall, arguably into another century. Now, we'll never know exactly what this whole body of early work is like because Cézanne destroyed many of them. But it's evident, I think, from the cumulative effect of these pictures that the seeming left-handedness, the ineptness of these pictures was not due to lack of skill. Like the apparent maladroitness of the bacchanals, such as this pastoral, it's the result of a lifelong quest for an intensity that would trigger the same powerful feelings as his own sensations in the face of actuality, not through illusionism, but through the character of paint itself. And we see him taking on his own close contemporary, near contemporaries. You see him repainting a version of Manet's notorious, celebrated Olympia, a modern Olympia, a painting which is so revealing in many ways of the not only the differences in Cézanne's program at this time, but profound differences between Cézanne and Manet. If you mentally imagine Manet's Olympia, which is all about display, presentation, making it all visible, the fact of the model posing, her engaging the viewer in a kind of complicity, the display of paint handling, the deliberate quotation made obvious from Titian, all of that revealed. The painting here that folds in on itself, the way Olympia herself folds in on herself, hiding in this collapsed pose. What the painting is about is that gaze that's exchanged between the Renaissance-type figure with, is that the bouquet? It's the ultimate bouquet, waved overhead, these threatening draperies on either side, the Pasha, this picture is also known, the man in black, regarding Olympia, but the gaze exchange between the figure and the seated man seemed to lock the foreground and background together. A very perplexing painting, and a picture which, a very small picture, but still I would say is arguably as potent as the painting it purports to criticize. This picture, which you could say is a kind of redoing of Manet's Le Déjeuner sur l'herbe, also small, also more uncomfortable, more ferocious, more perplexing, more turned away, once again, than the painting that it comments on. Only one figure faces us, of the, except for this introspective, folded surrogate for the artist himself in the middle. The nude who displays herself but does not look at us in the same way as Manet's figures and slides out of the corner of the canvas. Everyone else turns his or her back. The change is at the beginning of the 1870s. Cézanne is living in Paris on the Quai de Bercy. This is a view outside his window. He is painting what he can see. He is observing rather than trying to reach into his inner demons. And it's a painting that, while not strikingly remarkable, is a painting that holds up and gets more and more interesting the more time you spend with it, because of its subtle orchestration of tonalities, because of the curious way this apparently uneasy alignment of trees, quayside, and those are the warehouses where the wine is shipped. This is the wholesale wine district. Those somehow don't make sense, and then the more you look at it, the more absolutely inevitable they seem. it's the beginning of looking outward instead of inward. And the painting that is usually taken as the moment of real transition is, of course, the superb Black Clock, a painting that at once has this kind of clear, classicizing, vertical, horizontal orientation, the folds of the tablecloth like the columns of a Doric temple, this thudding, steady rhythm across the bottom, everything pushed a bit to the top, and yet it's still the same person who painted the Pastoral, who painted the New Olympia, who painted all of these allegorical, lurid rapes and invented scenes, the bacchanals that we've seen before. Look at the way that shell is painted. And look at the way the objects, the clock, that typical vase of the 1890s, of the 1870s, and the lemon, which is tucked behind the napkin. All of the tension is still there. And so I think when we look hard at his later work, the extravagance of Cézanne's early work becomes less surprising, because the same pounding emotion is present just below the surface in even the driest of his mature paintings. It's detached from explicit reference, it's detached from narrative, it's transformed into ferocious scrutiny, and is disguised as scrupulous modulation of tones. The anarchy of the early paintings should make us admire all the more the intelligence that allowed Cézanne to channel his emotion and subordinate it to painterly considerations, to the enduring benefit of his art.
Explaining Cézanne has always been a problem. We all feel he marks a decisive point in what painting is and can be. And at the same time, it's hard to put one's finger on exactly why that is the case. The problem is not young. As early as 1907, Maurice Dennis wrote, "I have never heard an admirer of Cézanne give me a clear and precise reason for his admiration." And this is true even among those artists who feel most directly the appeal of Cézanne's art. Pissarro, writing to his son Lucien, "Renoir has it exactly right when he says that these paintings have that je ne sais quoi." I don't know what. Nor has the situation improved since. The expository writing in the recent Philadelphia show is very uneven, with a number of passages being so ill-comprehending as to raise a question of the professional competence of the writer. At our last session on Cézanne here at the Studio School, Andrew Ford made a very cogent observation, the implications of which I'd like to take further. Andrew cited the critical apparatus of Harold Bloom, the literary critic, which holds that the strong writer of any generation misreads the work of the earlier artist who influences most directly his or her formation. Andrew represented those movements which seemed to claim to be descended from Cézanne to constitute such misreadings, even to the point he used the word parody. Cubism, Fauvism, Futurism, painting of Giacometti, and he might have included Expressionism as well. It's a very important point. We all know what he means by it. And yet the way he put it, at that moment, although it was very stimulating to me, was essentially negative. And it doesn't. Tonight, by way of a different image, I'd like to explore the issue he raised in a way which I hope will be fruitful for the understanding of Cézanne. This is the familiar Indian story of the blind man and the elephant. Some of you know. Trying to understand what an elephant really was. One bumped into his side and he exclaimed, "Aha, it's a wall." And another one, grasping it by the tusk, said, "Oh no, it's much more like a spear." While another, the opposite end, had grabbed up of the tail and said, "You're both wrong, an elephant is a kind of rope." And then another, grasping the trunk, said, "Ah, it's really a serpent." And you know, the ear and the leg and so on. Now, we can see that they were each right in a sense, because they're having a tangible reaction to what they had touched. And that this is the same sense in which Cubism, Fauvism, Futurism, and so on are right in claiming a descent from Cézanne, but nevertheless, as Andrew has told us, misreadings. That is, that they take the part for the whole. So then, the central task for us in explaining Cézanne is to propose something which could have inspired such separate ways of grasping of what Cézanne might be at, and at the same time displaying for Cézanne that essence which gives it its distinctive unity. This task is made somewhat more difficult by the fact that many aspects of what we take painting to be, simply as a matter of course, what we take for granted as how painting works, come from Cézanne in our present consciousness, so that we tend to overlook the very real issues involved in their coming into being. Taking it for granted while at the same time not realizing or understanding his distinctiveness. The most important of these, and which comes about historically a good deal earlier than Cézanne, but without which Cézanne, the eventual Cézanne, the Cézanne which was represented as Act 2, the important development is the premise that painting's value and interest come from the seeing rather than from the thing seen. This proposition is still widely uncomprehended. It's a deep and complex question which in its historical causation we can't go into tonight, except to note that it was the principal arena of struggle and misunderstanding throughout the 19th century for Constable, Turner, Moreau, Manet, and so on, and that from all of these, the interest in what goes on in seeing points to Cézanne. In this sense, that what goes on distinctively in Cézanne's seeing can be explained actually by a word which some of you have heard me use in the past, which I use a lot and for a reason that I learned from Cezanne, and that word is thematization, which is very close to what is called the stream of consciousness. And what it means is this, that at each and every time we see something, we don't see exactly what it is or all of what it is, purely and simply, but only in a certain way. For example, this piece of paper. Couldn't use anything. You can see it as a rectangle of such and such proportion. You can see its orientation. You can see its phenomenal shape. That is not as a rectangle, but the shape you would put on a canvas or on a pad when drawing it, as if the rectangle is changed by perspective. Or you could see its whiteness, or you could see its whiteness in relation to the whiteness of the wall. Or you could see its position in space in relation to other things around it, or the direction of an edge in relation to space. And so on. You could also see it, or any given object, it doesn't have to be a piece of paper. Any object of perception for its associations, or its symbolism, or its denotation of some psychological situation, so on. The point is that at any one moment in time, you can only see it in one way, as, for example, in the successive ways that I just led you on to think of it as. Each of these is a particular registration of meaning, and the flow from one grasp to another is its thematization. Just as one follows a sequence of sounds in a musical theme. All this I learned from looking at Cezanne, Cezanne's paintings over many years, and it is important for the understanding of Cezanne as for no other artist that I know of. Starting from the premise, broached in two of the presentations, is Act 1 and Act 2. Starting from the premise that the seeing is what is important, which he seems to have been persuaded of by Pissarro, every element that he looks at to paint becomes thematized in a particular way. The arch of a tree branch, the thrust of a rock into space, the rhythm or gesture of a figure, and so on. And even more importantly, which was touched on by other people, which I set up the issue in this way, he thematizes these into their particular use in a painting. And from this, thematizes the elements of paintings themselves, brushstrokes, colors, lines, proportions, so that instead of using each successive element of applied paint as the imitation of part of the appearance of a sight seen, every stroke is a thematic decision, locked into a number of relationships in which it participates, so that the analysis of the elements in nature, the motif, are all for the sake of a hitherto unanticipated unfolding of themes which comes into being by virtue of the emergent picture. The explanation in turn for this can be found from another sort of picture. The picture which is gradually emerging in the neurosciences today of how the human nervous system works, the understanding of which is as important for seeing as an understanding of the technical vocabulary of painting is for the appreciation of paintings. Excuse me, I have to get another drink. Very you up what does go on in C. The stereotype notion is that the nervous system, our nervous system, is a passive processor of visual information after the model of a computer. And this view is still widely held, but is failing. It fails every year, every new paper on the subject which is published. The actual case is much more complex. Throughout our lives, even during our sleep, our nervous system is the scene of thousands and millions of discharges of chemical electric energy in tens of billions of cells all the time. These take place in patterns of immense complexity, as if a symphony orchestra composed of billions of instrumentalists were playing each a separate tune, and the whole aggregate effect was comprised into one structure of meaning. The same thing that I showed you with the piece of paper, that we are aware at any one moment in time of a given aspect of our thematizing. In conscious perception, as against merely ongoingness of our bodies, each ingredient of the percept, such as various aspects of form, color, location, which I've shown you, and other qualities, location, associations, memories, emotions, valuations, are all incorporated simultaneously into this complex ongoing pattern and change its meaning. Moreover, as we select or focus our attention on what William James referred to as the buzzing, blooming confusion of sense experience, we are playing an active part in reorchestrating these patterns. That is to say, our conscious choice and awareness of themes modify the ongoing nervous activity to make it play new songs, as it were. Now, Cezanne was not, of course, the first person to thematize. It had been there all along in human understanding, particularly in music and poetry. But he may have been the first to develop his thematizations in this particular way. He also joins that spirit of his age, which is exemplified, for example, by Baudelaire, Dostoevsky, Freud, Mallarmé, Strindberg, Brahms, by the discoverers of non-Euclidean geometry, Riemann and Lobachevsky, and by Saussure, the founder of the modern study of linguistics, above all by Friedrich Nietzsche. All of these, and for painting, Cézanne in particular, which is what we're talking about tonight, changed the terms of human relation to the universe. From that of our being passive receptors of something given to creative to creative reshapers of possibility. This constitutes a drastic modification of consciousness. A noted neuroscientist has characterized the relation of human consciousness to animal awareness as a higher consciousness, because it is consciousness of the self who is being aware. Some of this is shown in Cézanne's own sayings, such as, I mean to express the powerful sensations. We would say perceptions in English rather than sensations, which in English is different. The powerful sensations I experience in the face of nature. Or, better still, to see is to conceive, and to conceive is to compose. Expressing a reciprocity between the inner and the outer world. Can we have the slides now, please? The fact of thematization is most clearly seen in what is called his constructive brushstroke, which is seen in its early form in the Bridge of Massy, painted about 1879. The chisel-shaped brushstrokes are not themselves descriptions of foliage, so much as the marks of the painter's decisions as to their use in the painting. First, you could say as a plane of a volume, then a weighing of the quantity of color, then an accent, then a mindset about important directions or rhythms within the picture. And they come from description, but are more conclusions about intentions as to what is cogent, thus determinations formed by the mind than simply a response to nature. Oh, I get the next slide. Oh, the next slide, I'm sorry, is a little overexposed, and I apologize for it. I thought it was better than that, and I didn't see how good it was until a few minutes before I came here. But we see the same kind of constructive brushstroke, the little chisel-shaped brushes in the houses of Provence at the same time, 1879. And we see how such sculpting and rhythmic intentions of reading into take over the whole painting, creating a wholly artificial or artifactual interpretation of forms while remaining completely readable of the subject. If one compares this particular painting with a photo of the motif, which I didn't bring in, but I've seen, it is clear that the forms have taken on a specific determinateness in excess of the reality, so that even the perspective tilts of the buildings are determined by the rhythm set up in the brushstrokes. Oh, I went backwards. Onward. How do I go onward? Thank you. Later on, this is about 1890, Bend in the Road. The whole sense of brushstrokes is different, almost the contrary, or the polar opposite of what we saw in the houses in Provence, because here they make a kind of set of flat color patches hanging in the air, with the space being brought into being by the intervals between the colors. And this makes the colors in our consciousness much more autonomous in the statement of the whole than they were in the previous pictures. That's one too many. I have to go. Ah, there. Okay, thank you. I mean, thank me. I'm getting it. Give me a little time. We see something similar in the light watercolors. Let me kill this one. I'll go back to the previous. Yeah. You can see the light watercolors, like this painting, which was actually influenced by the watercolors, has a sense of patting the picture space into shape, like touching it all over and bringing out the form. And one gets the sense, particularly in the watercolors, that the picture would have been a complete picture at any stage in its creation. That each mark, each addition to it in some way changes the theme, enlarges on it or directs our attention in the same way as when we listen to well-structured music. We see that each note or each passage changes our idea of what the piece of music is about. Now I can go to what the tutor before. Let's see if I can hit it. Yeah. Something like this. I think we feel about the late works of de Kooning, where what is most admirable in the late work, and many past this, which was painted in 1977, is the glimpse into new possibilities of schemes of arranging within the four sides of the canvas how volumes in space can be presented or thought of. In de Kooning, of course, this is a reversal from Cezanne as to the relation between form and description. That is, we have to read into the paint some kind of representational subject matter in order to appreciate the form. And this is what Clement Greenberg called, I thought rather miscomprehendingly, homeless realism. Of course, homeless realism. Homeless realism. It's his first. Of course, de Kooning, although he swore by Cézanne, is a big distance from Cézanne. And this takes us back to the story of the blind man and the elephant. Each of Cézanne's epiphanies, thematizes but a portion of Cézanne's concerns. And in so doing, projects onto what they take a whole world for themselves of relations and meanings. The reason that we feel Cézanne to be so much richer than his Cubist or Fauvist or Futurist Byblos is that these latter seek too quickly to impose their will upon the material, where Cézanne's thematizations involve a complexity exactly assimilable to the complexity of the neural processing which I related to you a few moments ago. Yeah, there we go again. Must be in this button. Yeah. And it is this that gives his work a life of a sort that the collector H.O. Havermeyer, who once owned this painting and gave it to the Metropolitan Museum, commented on when he said that this view of the Arc Valley, that it reminds one of so many things. This gives them a tension between the immediate sensuous fact and the associations, similarities, compulsions, and valuations that arise from the elements of the forms themselves. Lights, please. What was striking to me in the Philadelphia show was Cezanne's sense of focus, that they could keep all these balls in the air. And so I asked myself, I said, which causes which? Which comes first? Is it the thematizing which causes the focus? Or the focus which causes the thematizing? And basically what the show said was, get serious. What that means is that each causes the other. Thank you. Now we have our improvisationist on the end here. I'll get back to my place. And Charles Cajori can comment. I'm still going to show any slides.
We'll shoot them all again. No. This is improvisation in the extreme. I was asked to be where I am now about 20 minutes before the program began. So I have been attempting to formulate something to say. When I started painting, I liked Delacroix, I liked Daumier, I liked the Mexican mural painters. I wanted to paint about death and life and love and blood and everything like that. And I couldn't bear to look at Cézanne. And that refusal on my part, or just indifference really, persisted until I found myself in southern France and walking, or driving actually, up a hill towards a little village, a walled town on the top of a hill near Provence. And you couldn't get into the walls because it was too narrow, and so we had to park and walk. And I remember, it's as though it happened yesterday. I walked towards the gate of this, and suddenly the sky came towards me and pressed forward towards me. The pathway that I was following tilted up, and suddenly I had some intimation of what Cézanne was about, I think. And increasingly, ever since, my involvement with Cézanne has been rigorous, to say the least. the notions of perception, which Louis has talked about, I think can be in part explained by the notion of the eye as a focusing and moving instrument of measurement. What happens to the world when that instrumentality is accepted is quite astonishing. Tables break apart and reassemble themselves in extraordinary ways. What happens is, one of the most extraordinary things happens is what happens to time. If you think of one of the landscapes, the Chateau Noir, for example, that's in Washington, you can start reading it in a certain way. You enter the picture, say there's a lane on the left side, which you enter and think of the space being controlled by that entryway. And then you get over to the other side of the painting, and suddenly the assumptions of the space that journey on the left had given are up for grabs, and suddenly you come back to the left side of the painting, and you can't enter it the same way again. And as you watch the painting, the journey that you can make through it is in constant doubt. It's perfectly convincing each time, but it has a multiplicity that is quite extraordinary. It's a little like an onion being peeled. Watching one of the great Cézannes, and you see the first layer, and then as you keep watching it, it shifts again, and there's another layer happens. I think that Cézanne is an extraordinary, rich, quite unexplored in a funny way. Even though he has been such a controlling influence, he's like a minefield that's only partially exploded. I think that the Cubists' reading of Cézanne served their purposes beautifully, but in the process of their use of his notion of time and so on, they removed, first of all, they distorted that notion of time. They illustrated it rather than embodying it, so that you see the effect of time as you might in a cartoon, on the edge of a form being fragmented to show the passage of time. But it is very different from the experience that Cézanne gives of being in time. The notion of paradox was mentioned. There are two things that I thought of in this pressurized condition. One is an experience that I had in the show at the Modern Museum some time ago of the late work. And it was in front of a quarry picture, a marvelous, one of the quarry pictures. And I was standing, I would say, at arm's length from it, and looking at it and tracing my journeys through the image as I was looking at it. And suddenly I sort of found myself staring right sort of in the center of the painting, and as I was doing this, the space of the painting surrounded me, and I became, I mean, it was more real than anything I guess I'd ever experienced. More real than what one in everyday life experienced. And it seemed to be a complete contradiction of the previous readings that I've been talking about. So I was very excited and puzzled. And I called up Andrew, and I said, Andrew, this has happened to me. How can you explain this? How can it possibly be that there be these two contradictory readings? And Andrew said, well, it certainly seems difficult, doesn't it?
Should have called Louis.
One further comment about the paradoxical nature of Cézanne, whom I think I share the notion of being maybe the greatest painter. But there's a story that some of you may know about Bonnard being visited by a interviewer right immediately after the Second World War, and there was a still life set up at the entry, near the entry of the studio. Beautiful still life, and but no painting nearby. And way over on the other side of the studio was a painting, obviously being worked on, of that still life. And the reporter said, Bonnard, how can this happen to you? Right? And Bonnard said, well, you know, I can work directly from nature for maybe an hour. And then it begins to overcome me. And I have to work away from it. And then he said, I'm not like Cézanne. I'm not armed against nature.
Thank you all for listening. Now it's your turn to contribute to this fascinating exchange. Some points have intersected, some points have contradicted, or some things which sounded quite comparable. I would like, in the interest of getting as many people as possible involved, for anybody who wishes to speak, to restrict your discussion to questions to the panelists. And there are sometimes when we have these discussions where people feel moved to make their own personal statements about the matters that have been discussed. You get your own panel for that. Question.
Well, you expanded on what you meant by thematization, but I was wondering if you could expand on what you meant by focus.
By focus, I simply meant how he could hold all these things together, which I think were ingredient in his ongoing consciousness, in such a way that they remain clear and available and get onto the canvas. Part of the contrary, and I don't mean this in a disparaging way, but I'm reminded of the painting of Jackson Pollock, where everything runs through consciousness and runs through activity and gets jammed together, where in Cézanne one has a sense of everything that has transpired has transformed itself from consciousness into the necessities of the whole picture. That's what I mean by focus, keeping it in focus. Good question.
I just wondered, aren't you going to have any discussion between yourselves before we get into it?
I'll take Graham's guidance on that.
Let's ask the audience for that.
Would you prefer us to cross-discuss or you to get into it? Cross-discuss.
Andrew, would you answer my question?
Okay, this is the beginning. Say it again.
Well, I was being somewhat facetious, but the question that I raised and indicated I called Andrew about, the two
About the painting that works
readings
one way and
yes.
works another way, another way.
Do you have a comment about that?
I think, I don't know if this is really being, perhaps trying to talk out of Louis' shoes, but it seems to me that one of the things that happens when you look closely at Cézanne is that you actually get changed as you look. The closer you read it, the more involved you get with reading it. And that means not just looking at the subject, not just sort of picking out the formal elements, but finally getting down into the fine texture of the thing, so that you find yourself living from brushstroke to brushstroke almost. As that happens, something happens in you, so that you aren't quite the person you were when you started off. Now, this can very easily happen sequentially, I think, in the sense that, well, I know I've experienced what you've described. I think the first time I really was knocked off my pins by it was looking at the big bathers, the first time I saw the big bathers in Philadelphia. And my sense was that after about half an hour's hard work in front of it, I was looking at a different painting from the one that I'd started off with. And not only that, but I was in a funny way a different person. I mean, not in a kind of, you know, I mean, I knew I was still the same person, but I was, my orientation had changed. My orientation had changed. Now, I think that if I understand what you experienced, there was something that happened that was very different to you coming into the painting left to right from what was happening coming in right to left. And why wouldn't it be? You know, I mean, I think that to expect it to be absolutely sort of mirror symmetrical in every direction would be to deny the nature of the painting itself. At least that would be my thought about it.
Want to have a crack at the same thing?
No, the only thing that I was thinking about when we were talking before was the idea about the cubists, and in a sense Andrew's point and Cajori's very interesting point, that it becomes more and more apparent that the cubists put the Cézanne back into the museums which Cézanne had tried to get out of all his life.
I wonder, just to go back, did you want to get in on this?
No, I'll crawl in.
I just wanted to go back to Cajori's question. Part of your question was that something which was unreal and stylized, artificial, became instead more like nature than nature.
Yes, yes. It seemed to me, I mean, it's happened very rarely. This was the major experience that I had. And yes, it became more real than real.
Well, that's what I want to clarify, see, because I think Andrew said a wonderful and sensitive thing when he says, "You are changed." It reminded me of the Wilkie poem about seeing the archaic Apollo. The seeing of the statue says, "You must change your life." But as to the question, why is it more like nature? I'd just like to add a little footnote. And that is, there is no such thing as nature. Granted, there are objective things in the world. You know, if I try to get up right now, I will upset the table. There are resistances to things. I don't deny that. But I'd like to give you a phrase from Maurice Merleau-Ponty, which is the prejudice of an objective world. That is, for there to be a world which has meaning, there must be a sentient receipt. And it is through the meaning of that sensuous receipt that we believe that there is a nature into which we fit.
It's Merleau-Ponty who wrote the celebrated essay called Cézanne's Doubt, which is about, perhaps, to oversimplify it, Cézanne's perhaps discomfort with the very issue you've just raised. I'm curious, I'm interested, when Cajori was talking about his epiphany that allowed him to start seeing Cézanne, because as I look back on it, it was Matisse that taught me how to see Cézanne. And I think my epiphany came, what got me to be able to see the bathers, which were in some ways the most difficult and the most accessible. I mean, you grow up in New York as a kid and you keep seeing the bather at the Museum of Modern Art, that becomes the most wonderful painting in the entire universe. And it's also a painting that's so difficult that you don't really know why you feel that way about it. But it was seeing the big bathers in London that I was seeing through my experience with Matisse that really got me to that was my hook. It took Matisse as the intermediary.
Can I draw you out on that just a little bit? So
Sure.
Specifying it. Does everybody know the bather you're talking about is the bather with the blue background?
The big
Single bather.
bathers.
Oh,
No.
Matisse.
The one in the Museum of Modern Art, of course, is a single bather, which is the one that's related to the bathers at rest in Barnes. You know, we both like so
Right,
much.
yes.
But the key work, the really transforming work for me was seeing the the large bathers that is in the National Gallery in London.
Yeah, that part of the equation I get. I want to know which is the Matisse which precipitated.
The Matisse which precipitated it was the what taught me to see the Cézanne was the Matisse bathers with the turtle.
With the turtle. Along the lines, no, I want to go into this because
The turtle was not the operative part.
it's not Paris. No, but go back in your mind, and can you, by the flashback, can you say what elements when you were in London looking at
Oh, easy, the drawing.
the linear?
Once my eye, which had been prepared by the Matisse bathers with the turtle, realized the connection between that drawing and the drawing of the London painting, then the form kicked in a new way, and the two really started talking to each other. And I think the experience of having been brought up on the Cézanne single bather was already in there for however many years it was of having gone to museums with my parents. And it all suddenly fell into place and made sense.
Now, I see that I had a misreading of what you had said, because when you first said
I
it...
probably misexplained.
No. This is a creative misreading, like what I started. When you said the Matisse, I heard you say, in the modern, I saw...
I didn't say the Matisse.
Well, so I misread. I'm going to tell you my misreading to illustrate. Michael is shaking his head, the things I said. I'm thinking of the Matisse female painter who is in the waves, whose back is to the observer.
Well, that
walking.
helped too.
That helped too. Now, you see, to specify the answer to my question about your experience in the tape when you, the National Gallery, excuse me. When I ran through my mind what you saw, and then ran through my mind what I saw the meaning of the blue in the National Gallery version, which is a different blue, it has a different spatial weight, a different descriptive function, in that one than the other big painters, or any other painters of Cézanne. I saw that Matisse leading the way by way of the blue. And that's another kind of example of thematization.
I might say something. There's a difference in our two beginning understandings of making of Cézanne. Your description through Matisse, but mine through the actual literal event, the experience of the world as some investigation of reality, right? Rather than through an art passage. And this leads me to say a couple of things. The relevance, it seems to me, of Cézanne at this point is absolutely crucial because increasingly, it seems to me, our experience of nature is increasingly remote. There are more and more buffers occurring between us and the sensual experience of nature. Everything from much of it derives from the photograph, which is a late Renaissance device, and and we're increasingly with all the new technology being many steps away from direct experiencing of the world that we're in, and as a consequence, the language of the visual language, which, as all languages do, must evolve or lose its life, has been fixed in a certain sense by the photograph. And it isn't that I like to go to movies. I mean, I fall into them. I believe for the moment that this is a real picture of the world that I'm experiencing in the movie. But Cézanne was pointing to a different structure, and a structure which has to do with the developments in other fields, not in any direct way. But you mentioned Einstein and Freud, maybe, and that whole incredible re-examination in the early part of the century of language. And Cézanne was absolutely involved in that. And in order for us to survive, it seems to me, I think we're in the process of committing suicide as a human species. And something has to be reestablished in our relationship to ourselves and in relationship to nature. And it seems to me that Cézanne was pointing that way. Merleau-Ponty said he was a painter of the first word. I think that's the approximate way. And it's very scary to think of the atrophy of this incredibly rich language, which, by the way, is the result of the thematization, right, that Louis has mentioned, is the result of an individual.
Exactly.
It does not happen through decisions made in committee. And increasingly, it seems to me, in our society, the committee decisions are running the world. Anyway.
Well, I think I share part of your protest, but I come at it 180 degrees. That is, I think that, I mean this in a friendly way. By my lies, you're self-deluding, and that I think the human fact is the fact internally of possessing language and all that that means for framing the world in an individual way. And the quotation that you so aptly gave from Merleau-Ponty is enigmatic in that it reveals exactly the paradox. It cuts both ways. It wasn't the first apple, it wasn't the first tree, it was the first word. So that's the privacy of language today.
Yeah.
Okay, question? Yep.
Yeah, I'm just interested in, it was interesting to me that occasionally I've heard parallels made between Picasso and Cubism and Einstein's theory of relativity, in the same way that you've made a sort of parallel between Nietzsche's use of language, perhaps, or the increasing idea of subjectivity over objectivity, and the idea of the self and of relativity. Where do you think that these concepts just emerge full blown to Cézanne? I mean, on his own, or did he? Who were his influences in this sense? It seems amazing to me because he was before many of those innovators in other fields in terms of subjectivity, and yet he arrived at something so spectacular in the field of painting that had never been done before.
Well, part of my whole discourse, just to take the very last part of what you said, is that novelty is real. Novelty arises in the universe not only on the geological scale, but on the human scale, the capacities of human beings. The other part of your answer, of your question, as to where did the impulse or vector to push Cézanne into the position that I've portrayed, and I think you were referring to my portrayal of it, is twofold. One is that the methods of art history are not adequate to disclose that, because they take documentary evidence of certain monuments of convention, and they're infinitesimally useful to deal with the problem we're talking about, or the question you asked. There is, I use the figure, the spirit of an age. And there is a causation in the sense that history creates the opportunities for novel creativity or novel decisions to emerge, but it doesn't dictate them. It awaits, if what Cajori is saying is true, that we each have to do it ourselves. And of course, that's the essence of what we're talking about. We're talking about Cézanne and his doubt. Is that there are many things which are commonly said to be in the air, many minute terms of experiencing, style of life, mode of life, the books you read, the operas you see. It seems to me important that Cézanne enjoyed writing Latin verse. You know, that was a vector toward his consciousness.
As a young man.
Well, you said what he did was a young man, so I'm going to talk about it.
Louis, could I maybe just intrude for a
Please.
few seconds? Just remind everybody that he was a very avid reader of Ovid, and therefore had a great understanding of metaphor.
Very good. But I would say one of the principal causes is the French Revolution and everything that was involved in the French Revolution. The making of, or reshaping of the role of the individual in society as the unit of value for that society.
You have to go further back than that. You have to go back to Locke, who had far more influence in France than he did in England. I was translated to French, read avidly, and in fact you can blame the French Revolution on Locke because of this notion of only direct experience being the thing that counts. And so, which was considered very subversive because it was seen as being anti-clerical. If divine revelation is no good as proof unless it happens to you yourself personally, if the burning bush speaks to you, you can accept it, but if someone tells you about the burning bush speaking, it doesn't count. This did not go down well with the French clergy. Nevertheless, it is a fundamental notion of Enlightenment thinking that it is direct personal experience.
Could I remind you, I think what's been said is tremendously interesting vis-a-vis the question that was asked. But you know, when you were asking that question, I was vividly reminded of that marvelous letter, you probably know, that Cezanne wrote when he, just 3 years before he died, to a young painter friend called Charles Cajori. He wrote several times to him. He liked Cajori very much. Cajori came and visited him on various occasions. But there was one letter that he wrote that really was almost as though Cajori had asked him the very question that you just asked. And he, in his strange elliptical way, tries to answer it. He says, starts off in his usual way, being sorry for himself, very tired, 64 years old, I must beg you to excuse me. But then he goes on, my heartiest thanks for your last letter, but I must work. All things, particularly in art, are theory, developed and applied in contact with nature. Let us speak more of this when I have the pleasure of seeing you again. This is the truest letter I have yet written to you, I believe. Very sincerely yours. Then he goes, P.S. When I see you again, I shall speak to you more honestly about painting than anyone else. I have nothing to hide. And then his final P.S. Primary force alone, that is temperament, that can bring a person to the end he must attain. Now look, it's all there, you see. He starts off with theory, and then theory corrected by the study of nature, or embodied in the study of nature, or extended in the study of nature, whatever applied in contact with nature might be. And then there's that strange sort of drawing back into himself and that leap forward, but it's temperament that takes it. So all of Locke and all of Louis' position, it seems to me, is condensed in that marvelous letter.
Just one tiny footnote. The whole equation of cubism with the theory of relativity and the fourth dimension was actually something that neither Picasso nor Braque had any use for. It was adroit marketing on the part of Kahnweiler to try to make this incredibly difficult, in some ways unappealing art, which I understand one of the trustees of the Museum of Modern Art, when told that they were planning an exhibition called Pioneering Cubism, said, oh dear, all those little brown pictures. And Kahnweiler was trying to develop a market for those little brown pictures, so he thought this would give it more intellectual credibility. The artists themselves didn't subscribe to this notion at all.
Way back.
On that point, don't you think there's a gestalt, a Weltangeist, I'm not sure if I pronounce that right, a kind of group mind that at that time was changing in all fields, and they may not have been related directly, where one artist related to theory, but that was in the air, so to say, in that time. That's what modernism is, that's what atomic theory is, that's why the change from the classical to the modern age came about.
Well, I did use the phrase myself a little while back, in the air, but I think the stronger point is that it can only be accomplished by its filtering through individual consciousness. That's the only mechanism for that. Which is what is rendered in the use of the term temperament.
Theory applied to nature.
Simultaneity of thought in the world mind.
Too mystic for this panel. You have to go back to the last panel, which is about the Oriental spiritualism.
What I noticed that's very interesting to me is earlier, let's say even in the middle of the 20th century, when Cézanne was spoken of, the aspect of formalism was so strong, and the analysis of his composition, and everyone spoke in a certain way about him. And I've noticed such a shift in the way you're speaking about Cézanne. It's quite fascinating. You're really speaking of time, process, and inwardness. You're speaking in a very different realm than Cézanne was spoken of even 20 years ago. So Cézanne is being... I remember very well when teachers were trying to teach about Cézanne, I feel a different mood coming over, and it's the inwardness of Cézanne, even if it's vis-a-vis his formal elements, it's the inwardness of him, and it's the time and the process that you've really been talking about. You can contradict this, but this is how
Yeah, I'll
I feel.
contradict you.
Yeah, go ahead.
You contradict it first.
All right. It doesn't seem to me that the previous concerns of formalism are being replaced. It's an extension of that investigation.
Yes.
But it's more than an extension. A rooting in different soil, I would say. You see, I think one of the things that was happening, and I share your memories of the way Cezanne talked about. One of the things that happened was that somehow Cézanne was, there was a tremendously strong attempt to push Cézanne into a kind of academy. Academy of the cone, this is etc., the sphere and the cylinder. And I mean, I think perhaps my experience might be of some interest here, because coming from England, which was the country of Roger Fry, who was above all the high priest of the formalist aspect of Cézanne, and who regarded as the paintings, particularly the still lifes of the 80s, as the pinnacle of his life's work, and who thought the later work showed a falling off, and who thought the young work, the black work, was ridiculous. It was Fry who was the main advisor to people like Samuel Courtauld in England who were buying Cézanne paintings. So anybody of my generation was really brought up on the diet almost exclusively of the still lives of the 80s, in which one was expected to look at this apple and see how round it is. Have you ever seen, is there anything in nature that's as round as that apple? Or look at how beautifully this corresponds with that, and how this shape repeats that shape, and so on. In other words, they were looked at as abstract paintings, really, as abstract paintings, sort of without the fuss. And I think that what seems to me so interesting is that in the last 20, 30 years, so many different openings have been brought into that discourse, placing its roots, not denying the existence of that tremendous formal string, but extending the roots of it, relating it to other aspects, relating it, for example, to the very thoughts about nature that Louis was bringing.
Well, you see, my nourishment was different than yours, Andrew.
No, I know that.
It's not only a question of soil, but food. I count myself a formalist. And I don't know, I was always a formalist, but I'm a formalist now. But my pedigree or my upbringing was that I sat at the feet of the abstract expressionists, particularly the CUNY, puzzling out, particularly decline. And then all the experiences of that generation and the arguments that took place at the club. And I always thought that Roger Fry was wrong, and so I never had that particular stomachache. But one of the key things at the club in all of the discussions based directly on what we're saying here. Almost every evening where something came up, and Mercedes is looking anticipatingly, and she'll remember it, whenever anybody made a statement, that somebody in the room said, "Oh, no, no, it's not that."